All right, let's start today by introducing ourselves. I'm Sam Wilsinski.
And I'm Woody Johnston.
And we're the Trident Consulting team. I'd like to start by saying thank you for the opportunity to present today. We truly appreciate your business. Now, what you've asked us here to do today is to give our recommendation on whether or not your corporation should engage in corporate inversion with a London-based firm. So let's jump right into it. We're going to start today by giving you the overview of the situation, the different considerations that you're going to need to keep in mind while making this decision. Then we're going to move on to what our vision is for what we want to see your company do. We're going to give you a plan for how we believe we can achieve this vision. We're going to give you an analysis of this plan to show why our plan is the correct course of action. Finally, we're going to conclude. We'll give you a couple of examples of previous companies to show you what you can kind of expect as a company. So let's start by taking a look at what our various stakeholders are here today. You have your shareholders who are expecting to see a dividend for their holdings and expect to see growth in their stock value over time. You have your employees who expect to be treated fairly for their labor and expect to have a reasonable expectation for stability in their careers. You have the company who needs to stay in business both in the short and the long term, needs to ensure their fiscal health, as well as your corporate values, what you hold near and dear to your heart. You have the consumer who is expecting to have a cheap or affordable, effective product provided to them that is safe and satisfies their needs. And the community who has an expectation that your company will engage in sound business practices that promote the overall health of the economy. And finally, you have the government who has an expectation for your corporation to pay taxes such that they can continue to finance their operations. So what are we going to consider today? First, we're going to consider the legal aspect. What your company can and cannot do under law when engaging in a corporate inversion. Next, we'll consider the financial aspect. What makes fiscal sense for your company both now and in the future? And finally, we'll consider the ethics. What are your obligations to the various stakeholders and how your company can meet those various obligations?
Thank you, Sam. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Now, before we can even consider being ethical, we need to make sure that all bases of the law are covered. Now, there are many different ways that you can go about performing a corporate inversion, many different loopholes and different laws that can be applied. However, there's going to be one main section of the U.S. tax code, that's Chapter 26, that's going to be most relevant in all of your cases. Specifically, there's two sections that are going to be involved, Section 7874 as well as Section 367. Section 7874 has two different aspects of it. First, we have the idea behind the 60/80 requirement. What this basically lays out is that U.S. shareholders, after the merger between the U.S. and the foreign company, have to have between 60 and 80% of the total stock shareholdings. This is basically to ensure that there's a fair and equal, companies are fair and equal in size, and that a large company in the U.S. is not swallowing up a small company overseas. There's also the idea behind the substantial business activity. For this to be met, 25% of the expanded affiliated group must be located overseas. The idea behind this is to ensure that there's a legitimacy behind the corporate inversion and that it's not just a fake office building overseas. Now, the idea behind Section 367 is not necessarily pertaining to how you can perform a corporate inversion, but it just has a little stipulation behind it. It basically says that there's a 15% capital gains tax associated with corporate inversion, assuming that it happens by nature of a stock market exchange, which it most likely is going to do. Most consider this a cost of doing business and don't really factor it into the long-term financial hits for the corporate inversion. Next, we'd like to look at the finances and talk about what would motivate a company to want to perform a corporate inversion to begin. Now, the current tax rate in the United States is 39.1%, and we can compare that to the United Kingdom's tax rate of only 21%. Now, assume a $1 million nominal annual profit, and assuming those tax rates, and we apply that out over the next 10 years. In the United States, you're going to pay roughly $4.5 million in taxes, while in the United Kingdom, you're going to pay about $2 million in taxes. This gap between the two tax brackets only gets larger when you apply it to corporations who have much greater profit values than $1 million, as we assumed here for practical purposes. There is a caveat, however, because there are some costs associated with performing a tax inversion, such as the capital gains costs that we talked about earlier, as well as acquisition costs and administrative costs. However, those don't compound over time, and although they may be substantial upfront hits to the company, they don't need to be considered over a long period of time and aren't really factored into it.
So now let's return to our stakeholders and consider what our actual responsibilities are to each of our stakeholders. To our company and our employees, your company is at its core in the business of staying in business. What that means is it has to ensure its fiscal health, both on the short and on the long term. Now, you also have a set of corporate values that your company holds near and dear to your hearts. It's what has established your corporate culture. And as such, you have a responsibility to uphold those corporate values. Finally, you have to ensure the stability of your employees' careers and the fair treatment for their labor. Now, our next set of responsibilities is to our shareholders. This can be succinctly summarized as we have a fiduciary obligation to our shareholders to maximize profit and long-term growth. To the consumer and the community. Now, this is partially motivated by your desire and your need to sell them a product, such that you have to provide them an effective, affordable product. But you also have an ethical responsibility to provide them a safe product. They expect that when they go to Target and purchase one of your goods off the shelf, it's not going to cost them some sort of health detriment in the future. You also have to undertake business practices that promote the overall health of the economy, so that the community as a whole can benefit from your presence. And finally, to the government, you have to pay taxes for services rendered. And we're going to investigate this obligation to the government a little bit further. Now, your obligation to the government is derived primarily from this ethical principle of the social contract. Now, typically, the social contract is applied to the relationship between individuals and government, specifically individuals giving up certain rights in exchange for the government providing them some sort of service. For example, I've given up my right to walk down the street and punch any random person in the face in exchange for the government guaranteeing that no one will do the same, and if they do, they'll be prosecuted. Now, corporations can legally be thought of as individuals, but also practically, it makes sense to apply this framework to investigate our set of responsibilities to the government. So as a corporation, you pay taxes to the government, and you also create economic growth by creating jobs, by reinvesting in the economy. Now, in exchange for that, the government provides a set of services. For example, they provide infrastructure, which allows your business and your corporation to function, as well as security. They create an environment in which your corporation can be successful. Further, the government has a responsibility through its various taxes, regulations, and regulations to create a conducive economic environment. That is one in which your corporation can be competitive and continue to grow in the future. So now, with our various considerations laid out, let's give you what our vision is for your company moving forward. We want your company to maximize profits in a legally sound and ethically responsible manner. And to do that, we're going to give you a recommendation that has the right intent. It intends to meet all of the obligations we've laid forth to you, the various stakeholders. It undertakes the right action that is legally sound and meets the intent that we've laid out. And finally, the right action leads to the right result in all three of our consideration areas. So what is our specific recommendation for you today? Well, we recommend that your corporation engage in this corporate inversion by acquiring 60% of the new expanded affiliated group, which is referred to the London group in the future. Now, this will satisfy your legal requirement to invert. It will also allow you to acquire new markets and achieve the tax benefits associated with corporate inversion. Further, acquiring only 60% of the stake will minimize your cost of acquisitions and satisfy the various components of the law. Now, we also recommend that you merge and maintain both businesses. This will ensure your employee continuity, both in the United States employees as well as the employees abroad in the new London group, and will exploit the synergistic relationship that you have identified between your two companies. And finally, we believe that you should use these tax savings from the inversion to develop new business. This will allow you to expand into these newly acquired markets and develop new markets to fuel your product, as well as develop new products which can meet a new demand set from a new set of consumers.
Now, our recommendation meets all major aspects to satisfy the governing that govern a corporate inversion. Specifically, we recommend that you acquire 60% of the new expanded affiliated group. What this means is that the U.S. corporation was only 1.5 times greater in size than the London company before the merger. What this means in the long term is that 40% of the new expanded affiliated group is still located in London and run by the London corporation and shareholders. This has a direct impact on the substantial business activity because that requires only 25%. The fact that we have 40% still located in London gives us some room to work with in the future of our company and doesn't really lock us into anything substantial. We also want to show the long-term demand of our product. I'd like to first note that 25% of consumers are unaware of what corporate inversion even is to begin with, so they're unaffected by our decision to invert. However, we have two graphs here. These graphs show that consumers care more about the cheap prices and less about brand loyalty when it comes to buying products. The different age groups, looking at the first graph on the left there, the different age groups represent whether or not a consumer would purchase from an inverted company, assuming that there was no change in price of the product after the inversion. Comparatively to the second graph, the same circumstances apply. However, in this case, there are lower prices after the inversion. There is a clear jump in every single age category, specifically the lower age, which is ages 18 to 29. This shows that consumers care more about the product price being lower as opposed to buying from an inverted company. That's less of an impact on that. We expect that to be important because we expect our low overhead to be a lot lower after our corporate inversion, especially with our new markets. And we expect the graph on the right to be more representative of our consumer base. Also, it's important to note that the United Kingdom is currently coming out of a period of recovery. Over the past few years, there's been a steady increase in consumer demand, and that is only expected to increase over the next few years. Now, we do have that fiduciary obligation to maximize profits for our shareholders. As we can see here in this graph, this is actual stock market data from Burger King Corporation. The red line depicts the date that they announced that they would be merging with Tim Hortons of Canada. As you can see, there's a clear spike in stock prices right after that, which correlates to an increase in dividends as well as stock values for all of your shareholders. Now, we also want to see your company grow from within. If we go back to that nominal $1 million of profit that we assumed earlier, and we take 5% of that post-tax profit and apply it to things like R&D, education, and put it back into your company, we hope to see at least 5% show up as pre-tax revenue the following year. If we go back and assume the 21% and 39.1% tax values, we see that the blue line represents profits that you will achieve in the United Kingdom with those tax values, while the red line represents profits you would achieve with having your corporation in the United States. The green line is the difference of those two, and that represents the profit that you would gain by performing a corporate inversion.
So now let's ensure that the right intent is actually being satisfied, that we're meeting our ethical responsibilities by revisiting our various stakeholders and our obligations to them. So to our shareholders, we have an obligation to maximize profit and growth. And we've done this by reducing our tax obligation and increasing profit. To our company and our employees, we had to ensure stability and growth. And we have done this by enhancing the long-term viability of our company, by reducing our tax expenditures and overhead, and by increasing reinvestment in the company. To the consumer and the community, we have to provide a safe, effective product and create economic growth. We've done this by providing a cheaper product by reducing our overhead, and expanded selection of goods by acquiring a new company and their products. And we've also increased the potential for job creation by increasing reinvestment. Now finally, we want to reinvestigate our ethical responsibility to the government, specifically the U.S. government. Now in the past, this has been a politically tenuous topic, with President Obama actually calling corporate inversions an unpatriotic practice. However, we want to cut through the rhetoric and reinvestigate what your responsibility actually is to the government. So the government has failed to create a conducive economic environment. The U.S. tax code is exorbitant, it's complex, and it's non-territorial. It's the highest corporate tax rate in the world. It has various loopholes that are often difficult for corporations to understand, and it's the only developed nation in the world that taxes both business within its borders and business outside of its borders. As such, the government has failed in its aspect of the social contract. It has not upheld its end of the contract. And as such, as in any contract, you can now break that contract. In essence, the government's failure here excuses your decision to invert. And we also want to highlight that under a capitalist system, with the intent here being a sound business practice, to grow our business in the future, to ensure our viability in the future, that the decision to invert could be made even if the government was meeting its end of the contract, in so much as you are allowed in a capitalist society as a corporation to do what is best for your corporation. However, we want to highlight that this is not just a clean break with the U.S. government. You're not going from the current level of tax expenditures with the U.S. to no tax expenditures in the U.S. As part of the social contract, you still have a responsibility to pay for services rendered. What that means is any business you do in the U.S., you have to continue to pay taxes on. You're utilizing U.S. infrastructure, you're utilizing U.S. security, and as such, you have a responsibility to pay for that. Now, there are practices that exist in which you can reduce your U.S. tax obligation on business in the U.S. as a foreign incorporated corporation. However, we view these as unethical as they are failing to hold your end of the social contract. Now, we want to go back through and highlight some of the consequences of inversion that you want us to specifically look at today. So first, we want to re-highlight that shareholder capital gains tax. In the short term, some of the costs of this inversion will be passed to your shareholders, and they'll have to burden that cost. However, we believe that the long-term growth in profits, as well as the short-term spike in stock value, will override these costs. Now, you wanted us to ensure that the demand for your product would not be adversely affected by this decision to invert. And we showed that consumer opinions are largely unaffected by corporate inversions. An example I want to use to highlight the consumer opinions is a little bit closer to home. For example, if a new Walmart opens in your community, oftentimes there will be threatened boycotts. There will be a lot of rhetoric that people are not going to shop at Walmart because they view their business practices as unethical. They feel that they don't treat their employees fairly. However, within a month, a lot of people end up shopping at Walmart because the prices are so good. The same kind of thought process can be applied to conversion. And we also want to take a look at the potential political fallout. And we will have to admit there are potential negative political consequences associated with this. Companies in the past, and will probably continue to be so, when they invert, will be dragged through the mud to some extent by the media and by various politicians. However, in many cases, this is a cynical use of your company's business practices by politicians to get a leg up on another candidate, to improve their standing in whatever election is coming up. We want to highlight, though, that your ethical responsibility to those companies, which we laid out in the previous slide, or to those politicians, we laid out in the previous slide that you don't have an obligation. They haven't given you a good faith effort to uphold their end of the contract, and as such, you don't have an obligation. Further, we believe that your decision to invert may apply additional pressure to these politicians to improve the tax system so that this is not a problem in the future. Now, the final consequence that we want to highlight for you is that if you invert and reincorporate in another country, you are no longer a U.S. multinational corporation. You're just a multinational corporation. Now, if your corporate values are such that you value being a U.S. company above all else, we'd have to recommend that you strongly reconsider the decision to invert. So let's go back through what we've discussed here today. We gave you three considerations: the legal, financial, and the ethical. And we gave you a recommendation that we believe had the right intent, the right action, and achieved the right result, such that we met all three of these considerations we laid out for you. Now, we want to conclude by giving you two examples of companies that have pending or completed corporate inversions. And the first is the Medtronic Covidien acquisition. Now, Medtronic is the fourth largest medical device company in the world, and they have recently are undertaking a $43 billion acquisition of Covidien to allow them to reincorporate Medtronic. Now, particularly with restructuring this deal, it's a legal deal. It should be allowed to go through. It's financially sound. Medtronic's going to save as much as $2 billion over the next 10 years in tax expenditures. However, we believe that this decision, or this acquisition, has failed ethically in that they have not met their responsibility to all of the various stakeholders. Specifically, Medtronic is undertaking various practices such as hopscotch loans off-sea to avoid repatriating funds that they will need to undergo this acquisition. In short, they're not just doing this because it's a sound business practice. They're doing it simply for the purpose of evading U.S. taxes. And these hopscotch loans are allowing them to not repatriate these funds and not pay IRS fees before acquiring and moving the business overseas. Now, a more positive example that we believe you should follow is the Burger King-Tim Hortons merger. Now, the Burger King-Tim Hortons merger, again, it's legal. It should be allowed to go through. It's fiscally sound. Burger King's reducing their costs and improving the long-term viability of the company. However, we also view it as ethical. They're meeting their various obligations. Burger King needed a new brand to be able to compete with Starbucks, to be able to compete with McDonald's. Tim Hortons is a well-established brand that allows them to do that. Burger King needed to expand internationally. Tim Hortons is an international company with the potential to grow. And Tim Hortons needed to expand in the United States. Now, as such, these two companies are exploiting a synergistic relationship that meets their various obligations and satisfies all these considerations. Now, with that, we'd like to thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, please fire away.
Yes, sir, I have a question for you. In preparing for this meeting today, I read